A continuación tenemos la etapa internacional de estas jornadas de actualización. Tenemos la conferencia magistral Impacto de la guerra en la salud mental por parte del doctor Goran Mijaljica. El doctor Goran es psiquiatra con especial interés en la psicotraumatología y psiquiatría transcultural. Es secretario de la sección de psiquiatría transcultural de la Asociación Mundial de Psiquiatría y miembro de la Junta de la sección de psiquiatría cultural de la Asociación Europea de Psiquiatría. Psiquiatra consultor en el Centro de Salud Mental del Hospital St. Charles, Fundación del Servicio Nacional de Salud del Centro Noreste de Londres, NHS Foundation Trust, Londres, Reino Unido. Y también es miembro del Comité de Ética de la Organización Mundial de la Salud y del Consejo de la Federación Mundial de Psicoterapia.
Buenos días. Estamos en el... Ahora. Buenos días todas y todos, queridas y queridos colegas. Es un verdadero placer estar aquí con ustedes. Quiero agradecer sinceramente al doctor Sergio Villaseñor Bayardo y al comité organizador del Congreso por la amable invitación, así como a la doctora Claudia Castellanos por su excelente coordinación. Deseo que esta conferencia sea todo un éxito, llena de aprendizajes, intercambio de ideas y valiosas conversaciones. Antes de comenzar, quisiera mencionar que mi presentación será en inglés. Pido disculpas. So I'm going to continue in English because I think I would master talking about mental health or is there something wrong with the... I'll bring it like this, yeah? Okay. So my today's talk will focus on the mental health impacts of war, and I'm going to try to coordinate because I'm going to show you PowerPoint in Spanish, and then I'm going to speak in English. I'm just going to this microphone. I think it would be better, yes. So the title of today's talk is The Impact of War on Mental Health. I'm going to speak a bit broader and probably try to explain the concept of war and war trauma and how we deal with that as mental health professionals. And I'd just like to mention the translation of the slides was done by ChatGPT, so if anything sounds or looks suspicious, it's not me. I'll blame it on ChatGPT. Sometimes AI can really be of help, I think. So how do we define war? What is a war? And I think it's always good to start with definitions because it makes it more clear what do we mean when we say something. Sometimes, as I was listening to previous presentations, many of them mentioned war, which is a very, I won't say good thing, but accurate, because war is a very common traumatic experience for a lot of people, especially for people who are refugees. And the definition of war is also important because some experiences can be very similar to experiencing a war. For example, in Sweden, where I lived for years, there is talk about gang violence, and sometimes it's being described as a state of war, where there's a lot of bombing, a lot of executions committed by organized criminality. And I know that there's a similar occurrence in Mexico as well, where some areas are especially affected by consequences of organized crime and gang violence. And that living in such an area can also have a very powerful impact on mental health and well-being of people who live there, if not broader, because all of you live in a society where you listen to the news and kind of are exposed to the information about the violence and the consequences. So a war can be defined as a phenomenon of organized collective violence that affects either the relations between two or more societies or the power relations within a society. Usually when we say war, we mean that one country is at war with another country, that armed violence is being used as a tool to achieve a certain political goal. Another very important concept, which I think it would be more current in context of today's talk, would be armed conflict. An armed conflict is said to exist where there is an armed confrontation between the armed forces of states, international armed conflict, or between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups within a state, non-international. I would also like to remind you of some international regulations, such as the Fourth Geneva Convention, which regulates some very important aspects of warfare and armed conflict. According to the Fourth Geneva Convention, following acts are and shall remain prohibited at any time. For example, violence to life and person, in particular murder of all kinds, mutilation, cruel treatment and torture, taking of hostages, outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment, and so on. I would just like to ask, when we talk about potentially traumatic events, when we talk to refugees and kind of listen and hear the testimony of people who fled an armed conflict, is there something that looks quite familiar? So even though a lot of these procedures are forbidden according to international convention, they are still quite common occurrence. For example, taking hostages, outrages upon personal dignity, murder, executions, and so on. So although we thought we came a long way since World War II, some phenomena are very, very frequently occurring. When it comes to our field, which is healthcare, there is a very kind of significant knowledge about the influence of conflict on morbidity and mortality. And there are different studies showing different impacts of morbidity and mortality, or of armed conflict, morbidity and mortality. So for example, according to this article, armed conflict, especially the most intense types, indirectly impacts civilian mortality. Our estimates suggest that almost 30 million civilian deaths were indirectly attributable to armed conflict globally between 1990 and sorry. The right thing. I'm just worried about the microphone. I'm not sure if you can hear me, because to me it sounds it kind of switches off every now and then. Maybe, yeah, let's see. The point of this is just to show that conflicts do not only take a human toll as a result of direct armed confrontation. For example, when we talk about the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza, the total death toll or the total consequences related to health, including mental health, are not only those caused by direct fighting, bombs, clashes, drones, and so on. It is much, much broader, because an armed conflict usually brings with it a total disruption of the society in varying degrees. So for example, if you take a look at healthcare system in Gaza, which has been almost completely wiped out, you can't expect people to get adequate treatment for a variety of healthcare conditions when it comes to that surroundings or that kind of constellation of circumstances. Access to water, food, proper healthcare, etc., limited, as well as social support. So conflicts have a great toll on human life, and it's not only caused by direct fighting. Another study which I wanted to show you is this one, and I think it's quite interesting. It was published in Lancet in 2021, before the war in Ukraine and before the ongoing conflict or war in Israel. So it says something which is quite disturbing, I think, that a number of non-displaced women and children living dangerously close to armed conflict, within 50 kilometers of armed conflict, increased from 185 million women and 250 million children in 2000 to 265 million women and 368 million children in 2017. And I'll just tell you one thing, all of the numbers, when it comes to displacement, number of displaced persons, number of refugees have been constantly going up in the past decade. That is a very worrying trend. What's also important is that women's and children's mortality risks from non-violent causes increases substantially in response to nearby conflict. For example, if you take a look at the map of Ukraine, Ukraine is a quite big country in European terms, one of the largest when it comes to territory. You can see one city, and then very close to it there's a city who's not in the war zone. But that city is very heavily impacted by war and conflict. Supplies, transit, number of refugees, the burden on the healthcare, social system, and so on can increase dramatically as a consequence of being just in the vicinity of a conflict. And I won't mention how life can be disrupted just being close to the conflict. If you have war in one country, probably the tourism rates in the country which is neighboring that country would go down, which means that the first reaction is, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go close to danger. That's a very common reaction because of the worry that something bad might happen. In this case, a lot of people don't really have the choice. Not a lot of people have the choice to leave. Some of them don't want to leave their homes either. However, being close to conflict increases the chances outcomes which can influence health in a negative. More than 10 million deaths in children younger than 5 years can be attributed to conflict between 1995 and 2015 globally. I think this is a tragedy. If you look at reports from Gaza, just mention one thing. I'm going to mention every possible conflict which I know of, and I won't go into politics because trauma, death, disease, they don't have a nationality. They don't bear a flag. The people who do bad things usually have nationality and the name. But I think kind of seeing the situation in its entirety is very good because then we understand the impact the conflict has on every possible society. What is also important is that I'm on the wrong slide. This is the right one. So this paper also concludes that armed conflict indirectly influences the chances of survival of people being in the vicinity of conflict due to malnutrition, physical injuries, infectious diseases, but also mental health, which is a very important. Now I've mentioned war, armed conflicts, the impact of conflict on people living in the conflict zone or close to the conflict zone. And I would like to continue by saying another thing. I've also mentioned refugees, but I haven't really defined who a refugee is. And this is an international definition. I just took it from the UNHCR, which is the UN agency for refugees. And they define a refugee as someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. Another big group, which is even bigger than refugees internationally, are people called internally displaced persons. Just to give you a shorter version, the reasons for leaving their homes are the same between refugees and internally displaced persons. The only difference is that a refugee leaves their home country or the country which membership they possess, and they go to the next country. It can be a neighboring country, which is the most common scenario, or they go to a third country, which is far away from their country. I'm going to mention that in a second. So The reason I'm mentioning this because there's a very concrete definition of who or what a refugee is, and it's a very important definition because refugees are entitled to specific international protections according to international law. Internally displaced persons, on the other hand, who may be in a very similar situation to refugees, should be protected by the country where they live, or their country, quotation mark. And another sad, I'm sorry, I forgot to change the slide again. I have to be better at kind of changing slides. Another sad statistics, which I also said I'm going to mention, is that the number of refugees is also increasing. So I keep updating this number for the past years, since I've been kind of talking about the mental health of refugees and treatment of PTSD and similar. So at the end of 2024, there were a total of 123 million displaced persons in the world. Out of that number, 36.8 million of people were refugees. The rest of them were mostly internally displaced persons. So the majority of people who are forced to leave their homes stay in the same country. They don't cross the border. But a part of them does. And that number, as of the end of 2024, amounts to 36.8 in the world. Do you know which countries are the top recipients of refugees in the world? Sorry? Poland probably could be one because of Ukrainian refugees. Turkey. USA is not even close, top 5. I'm a bit unsure, but maybe. So number 1 is Iran, I think. And then you have Turkey, and then you have Germany is number 4, the only European country on the list. Colombia is one of the largest recipient refugees when it comes to countries due to the conflict or the situation in Venezuela. There's millions of refugees in Colombia as well. So, you know, when we talk about migration, things can get very heated. There's a lot of attitudes, there's a lot of politics, especially in Europe, which focus heavily on the question of migrants and so on. But in reality, a very small number of refugees reaches third countries. Most of them stay in the surroundings. For example, Syrian refugees, if they leave their country, most of them don't, even if they are displaced. They don't leave the country. But if they do, most of them will go to Turkey, which is a neighboring country. For example, if we look at Ukraine, many millions of Ukrainians left. Where did most of them go? Poland, surrounding countries, for example, Slovakia probably, or some of them reach Scandinavia as well. But most of them stay in the neighboring countries. Poland has a few million of Ukrainian refugees, mostly in the south of the country. Why do you think that is? Sorry? Yeah, but for example, if I was a woman and my husband cannot leave the country because he has to go to war, which is the case in Ukraine, and conscripted to the army can't leave the country. So if I was a woman married to a man who is in the military, I would like to stay close to the border to be able to meet my husband and probably take my children with me, and then come back to Syria. So a lot of people stay close because of different reasons. They don't want to go far away. They want to be close to their country. They want to be close to their family who stayed in the country where the conflict was ongoing. So I think that's a very important thing to mention, that most people don't really wait to get a flight to a third country, even if that country is a high-income one and has a very generous social system. Most people choose to stay in the country or in the vicinity. Part of them goes further. Now I'd like to remind you of the conflict or the war in Ukraine, which actually started more than 10 years ago, when fighting broke out in Ukraine's eastern region, Donetsk and Luhansk. And even then, there there was a lot of kind of guerrilla fighting in a way. There were different armed groups engaging in conflicts, etc., even before it was clear that this is an international conflict. However, I read a book published by two Swedish journalists where they describe their encounters with persons from Ukraine. And I think this is a very kind of powerful dialogue, a very, very important one for mental health professionals. So you can see the translation. I'm just going to read it shortly. Those bastards have abandoned us. We have nowhere to run. My son is 8 years old. How can I protect him, she wondered. The tears flow and her voice rises in a falsetto, even though she was completely calm until now. Grenades fly over our heads every day. How can I live like this? It can start at any time. There is no way to protect yourself, she sobbed. Her name is Svetlana Manakova, and she previously worked at a power plant nearby. Now she has no job, no income, no water, no electricity. And I think this vignette is basically a very universal experience of many people living in a country. It's not only the bombs, it's the helplessness, it's the inability to protect your family, it's not having a job when you once had a job, it's not knowing what the next hour or the next day brings. So all of this uncertainty, in addition to some psychiatric or psychological phenomena, I think are very well described in this case. And don't forget that not having a job, not having income, not having water, not having electricity, all of those can influence mental health negatively, even outside of a conflict area, but especially in a conflict, because there's no alternative. Social support systems usually are influenced by conflict. Kind of the possibility to make income and provide for your family is very limited. And then this case continues, or this vignette continues, which I think with something is also extremely important. She was with her son, Dennis, who looks seriously at his mother and then reproachfully says, "Mom, calm down." And the journalists write that it's not the first time I have seen a child trying to calm down their mother in Donetsk. The kid's attempts to be stoic and good, want to cry myself, journalist. And I think when we look at war and the experiences of children growing up in war, there is a common understanding that the children are forced to grow up a bit more quick when there's a conflict. The children have to assume some responsibilities which normally adults do. Children usually are there as the ones who comfort their parents, parents being completely destabilized, how to put it, overwhelmed by the situation, in addition to not being able to provide or protect their children. And this feeling of hopelessness is, I think, an extremely difficult feeling to manage for any parent. And if we look at some ongoing conflicts, I was just at the World Congress of Psychiatry in Prague, where there was a presentation about psychological support for people in Gaza. And then the presenter said that it's pretty much about supporting them living through the day, because they never know what tomorrow might bring. So their goal is not to be free from, for example, PTSD symptoms or from nightmares or stress or whatever. The goal is to make it through the day. And one of the victories they mentioned in that presentation was finding water. So it's not, finding a job or buying a bigger house or buying a car. It's like finding water. So I think that really puts things into perspective, how priorities can change and how people can completely modify their functioning to the conflict situation. I just want to ask you a question. I'm going to try to make it interactive, but what is the first thing that comes to mind when someone says war trauma or experience of it? So if you meet a patient, for example, I worked with a lot of refugees, many of them had war experience. What do you think is what does first come to mind when someone says they have experienced war? PTSD, basic needs? Oh, thank you. Usually people say bombs, explosions, death, drones, military aircraft, and so on. But Basically, sorry? Yes. So there's a lot of different experiences. War is not only one experience. I've never heard of a war which ended in 5 minutes. War is usually days, if not years or decades in some cases. For example, if we think about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the conflict there has been ongoing since the 90s. Millions of people have died, directly and indirectly, as a result of that conflict. So living in conflict is not one day or one experience. It's a lot of experiences and a lot of situations. Some good, but most of them can be very bad. And mentioning war and talking about war and all of these things, including explosions and lack of water and lack of resources and lack of access to healthcare, brings me back to psychotraumatology, defining what potentially traumatizing events are, because it is important in the diagnostic and clinical sense to identify the experiences or situations which might be interpreted as potentially traumatizing. So these are powerful and upsetting incidents that intrude into everyday life. They're usually experiences which are life-threatening or pose a significant threat to a person's physical or psychological well-being. An event may have little impact on one person, but cause severe distress in another. I think this is extremely important as well. If you work with refugees, for example, look at how many people sit here. So one of you will have this type of experience of listening to a talk in English. Another person will think it's fine, I can still read. Another person will leave the room. It's pretty much the same like every given situation or experience in life. Experiences are individual, although they might seem the same. So if you meet a refugee, refugees can have a trillion of different types of experiences. Not only one, it's not the same experience as the next person. So allowing this individuality in assessing what the person has actually been through is really important. For example, I've met a patient and he told me that he experienced a car bomb going off and that there were people lying around on the road, dead, missing limbs and so on. So I said, oh, but that must have been terrible to experience. Like, how does it influence you? It doesn't really influence me much, he said. He had completely different problems. So his problem was more that he couldn't provide for his family. He was stressed every day that his children won't have food. So that's what caused his PTSD. The fear of starving to death and everything that kind of went along with that. This was just something he told me on the side. Even though it sounds very distressing and it is a potentially traumatizing event, it didn't traumatize him. It didn't leave consequences. And that's also very important. We shouldn't jump to conclusions when people tell us that. We always have to assess how did the person react to what's their experience. Then as an example, and you mentioned this, like lack of food and water, are very common experiences that people describe as potentially traumatizing. It doesn't mean that we will diagnose PTSD in a person simply because they had lack of access to water or because it was difficult to get access to something similar. But it is possible that the people report that as being very, very upsetting, traumatizing, and very kind of disruptive. The feelings of being close to death or experiences of being close to death, lack of shelter, serious injury, and then a bit lower combat situation, torture, murder of family or friend, rape or sexual abuse. So they are all there on the list, but some, as you say, violations to meeting basic needs usually score quite high when it comes to what people experience as potentially traumatizing. Then when it comes to kind of the number of people who experience potentially traumatizing events in their lives, there are different studies, and I think my colleagues have presented some during previous talks, so I will stay clear from that. I would just like to mention that there are studies kind of being done showing how many people in a given conflict experience different situations of trauma. So in this case, for example, children in Gaza were experiencing bombardments to residential areas and destruction of residential areas, and then that they were confined at home, unable to go outside, that they were witness to the profanation of mosques, and that they were exposed to combat situations. So although many people think combat is the first thing, which is kind of the most important, or destruction, comes to war. Actually, some other things may come more often when we talk to people who actually live it. It doesn't make this less important, but it's just important to know. And then I think all of this has been described, so maybe I should save some time and just continue, because traumatic events are not directly interpreted as psychological trauma. Psychological trauma is basically a combination of what the person has experienced and how that experience has influenced that person, including emotions, memories, relationship to themselves, to the world, to their families, their functioning in everyday life, and so on. So there are different definitions of trauma. I think all of them are good in their own way. But usually to understand what trauma is, we need to kind of go a bit further and do some more reading. And now to the topic of today's talk, basically. What is war trauma? The word trauma itself, comes from the Greek word for a wound or an injury. So basically, war trauma can be defined as in the psychological context, of course, as a psychological consequence of the experiences of war. So I took this definition created by artificial intelligence because I like to play with ChatGPT sometimes, or AI, just to see how things can sound in a more simple version. And then we kind of add to that. We can always, as humans, add different kind of perspectives, different tones, different colors to what we get in this very raw, simplified version. So war trauma refers to the psychological distress and emotional suffering experienced by individuals as a result of exposure to traumatic events during times of war, such as being victim of a violence, causing harm to others, or losing loved ones due to conflict. And again, in this definition, there's a lot of focus on victimhood, perpetratorhood, but also loss. That is very commonly altogether associated with war. However, it might also be that the definition is not that simple. And I'll try to explain why. To complement the issues that the war kind of causes, or the way that war impacts mental health, are not only often linked to violence exposure, such as witnessing or participating in war-related activities, but have also been related to dimensions of post-conflict context, including limited employment opportunities, household dynamics, and community-based stigma. So simply focusing on the destructive parts of the conflict is not enough to fully understand the impact of war on mental health and well-being of people who are affected. I'm just going to share a short example from a war that is very familiar to me personally, because I grew up I was born in former Yugoslavia, a country which disappeared in a war in the 90s. And I won't maybe go too much into the history, but I'll just give you a couple of examples to kind of give you an idea what different experiences people can have during a war. And let me remind you that this war lasted, in this case it was the war in Bosnia, it lasted between 1992 and 1995, so that's more than 3 years. Croatia, it lasted for 4 years, 1991 to 1995. So many things can happen during that time. Now, people go to school, people graduate, people go to the first line of combat and maybe don't come back home alive. People get injured, but then again, a child is born, people go to school, people get married, people are happy, children are playing, but children also can die because of a bomb. So a war or living in war can be a very confusing experience for them. Unfortunately, it does become a normality for the person living in that environment, because every human, due to our inborn resilience but other phenomena, adapts to the situation in order to survive, as I see it. So according to this example, it kind of colors a somewhat positive example during the war, and it goes like this: even though it was difficult, I still have some very nice memories. I made friends for life. I remembered that they called us domski, which is a kind of colloquial term for children placed in an orphanage. They looked at us as some bad people, but it's not like that. Many of us want to become something. I proved it by being successful in life. I graduated from college, I'm doing my job successfully, I got married. Every child, even if he lives in a home for children without parental care, should follow this. here we have basically, this was taken from an article describing a presentation of a book about experiences of war from a child's perspective. And it gives kind of a somewhat balanced image of living through war as a child. Something nice, polar lights from north of Norway. And I'm slowly going to conclude. I think I still have a few minutes. We were running a bit late, right? So I would just like to point you in the direction of some publications, of some research when it comes to the impact of conflict on mental health. For example, this WHO-led meta-analysis from 2019 has showed that 1 in 5 people in a post-conflict setting suffers depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, which is quite a huge number and basically very important for planning of healthcare in conflict-affected areas. But as we all know, healthcare in conflict-affected areas is not usually on its top even before the conflict. So for example, countries such as Congo already have a very low or not significantly developed healthcare system. And then the conflict both destroys what's available, plus impedes development services in the future. Lack of funding, lack of qualified professionals, and so on. But I think these numbers kind of just illustrate how powerful the impact of conflict is on mental health. I would also like to point out one other thing. So here you can see 5 mental health disorders, severe mental health disorders described: depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Usually when we think about war, conflict, traumatic events, and so on, the first condition which comes to mind is PTSD. So you've been through war, you must have, or you probably have PTSD. That is not the case. PTSD is only one of the psychiatric or mental health conditions which is connected to the experience of traumatic event. And usually it's not even the most common one. Usually depression is far more common as a consequence of experiencing a traumatic event than PTSD itself. And when we look at the number of people who experience potentially traumatizing events, which is between 70 and 80% of all human beings, be it a traffic accident, death of a close person, whatever it may be classified as potentially traumatizing. And when we compare it to the incidence of PTSD, which different studies put between 2 and 9%, sometimes less, sometimes more, but I would say 6% would be an average, general average. We see that not everyone who experienced potentially traumatizing develops PTSD, which means that proper diagnosis, listening to the person's experiences, describing symptoms is very important to providing adequate health care. I'm just going to briefly describe the mental health of refugees and migrants, because refugees are, especially persons who, because of the very definition of who a refugee is, are more vulnerable to mental health issues in a way. And there are different reasons for that, including, for example, coming to a country where you don't speak the language. So imagine being a 60-year-old Arabic-speaking Syrian refugee and ending up in France, where you don't speak a word of French, and then you need an interpreter to communicate with your psychologist, psychiatrist, or any other healthcare professional. It's very difficult to express yourself, to tell them, and to make them understand how you feel and what might be the issue, and understanding the help that is offered. The level of health literacy among refugees can also significantly vary depending on their personal background, level of education, previous experience. I think this is also important to mention that there are also issues described which are related to safety and lack of shelter, food, water, clothing. All these basic needs basically come to the top of the list very often. But also something which is not a very good side of today's world is that there is a rise of a very polarized discourse when we talk about certain groups of people. And there is documented influence of experiences of racism and racism as a phenomena and how it impacts mental health of people exposed to racism. It is also connected with poorer mental health when it comes to different studies. Now again, back to my old home country. There's another example of why experiences of war are not only limited to destruction when it comes to physical destruction of buildings or loss of life or experiences of bombing, combat. So this was from a publication from Sweden where this researcher was working with Bosnian refugees. And he interviewed a Bosnian refugee who told him about his experiences of being taken prisoner by the attacking army. Basically. So he says, what did the transport to concentration camp look like? And yes, we did have concentration camps in Europe in 1990. So it's not only the Second World War, unfortunately. The people in the van started looting. They had camouflage uniforms, Ray-Ban sunglasses, black gloves. We were terrified. We experienced shock after shock. The impossible had become possible. And just as a side note, that's a common feeling when something like that happens. You can't believe this is happening. Like, this was my city, my school. Now, like, everything's being destroyed. People I thought I knew, looks like I don't know them anymore. Like, it looks very surreal, speaking about this, like, dissociative phenomena, derealization, and so on. When I saw how they mistreated the men they picked up, and when I saw who was guarding them at the railway, that it was my workmates, it was an even worse shock. You had worked with someone for 14 years and we had gone through good and bad times together, shared everything with each other. I ended up in a state of shock. And a lot of people who were severely traumatized will explain this feeling of loss of trust in humanity. They have very, very difficulty believing that the world is a good place. They have a lot of difficulty in trusting people after what they've experienced. There's a lot of talk about moral injury these days, which is usually connected with research based on military, but I think this dimension of moral injury, kind of how this type of traumatic events, such as the ones described here, can influence the person's system of beliefs, which is a very important part of understanding how trauma can impact mental health and functioning. So, for me, war trauma is beyond destruction. War shatters social trust, reduces social cohesion, and damages social capital, as described in this article. Following armed conflict, societies may remain deeply divided into subgroups that fear and hate each other and are ready to continue fighting. People who suffer from war trauma frequently have reduced willingness to reconcile and seek peaceful solutions with the other side. For example, in eastern Croatia, it's not uncommon to say that there are Croat and Serb kindergartens or Croat and Serb schools, keeping children effectively segregated from one another as a consequence of a conflict which ended 30 years ago. So conflict is not only destruction, it's many more things that add up to that, kind of reveal its destructive power. This is another polar light from northern Sweden this time. And you have, this is the one. And you've heard about the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and I'm going to give another talk about treatment of complex PTSD tomorrow, so maybe I will try to save some time and save it for tomorrow. The same goes for complex PTSD, which is a new diagnosis in ICD-11. The previous presenter has presented all the diagnostic criteria, so I can save a bit of time on that. When it comes to war-related PTSD, I just wanted to illustrate some epidemiological data, just to kind of understand what it looks like. But, you know, wars are such fascinating phenomena. For example, Europe is still dealing with the concept of second war. For example, there are still unresolved issues when it comes to death, destruction, who did what, who's to blame, who should be brought to justice, even for a war that ended in 1945. Imagine the wars or conflicts which followed after that. For example, no one thinks as Great Britain as a country which is facing consequences of a conflict. But in reality, the armed conflict in Northern Ireland also ended a few decades ago. So it's also quite a fresh memory, impacting a lot of people living in Northern Ireland. And well, so Europe as a continent is trying to metabolize a lot of the conflicts which happened in the past century. And I won't even mention other parts of the world, how that is going. But this study, which I found very interesting, was aiming to explore the symptoms related to World War II trauma and symptoms of PTSD on a national level in Poland. And then they compared and realized that the prevalence of PTSD among civilian survivors of World War II ranged from 1.9 in Austria to 10.9 in Germany, while PTSD among Polish survivors of that war had been reported to range from 29 to 38%. That's quite a lot. Thinking about their trauma is dated back in the 1940s or the Second World War. So see, like, it's not then, it's today. So what happened then is impacting how these people have it today. Something described in psychoanalysis as Nachträglichkeit, or like something I experienced back then in the time is still influencing me even today. It's still manifesting itself. Another example of a study would be this one from Ukraine as well, 2023. So they did like a comparison, 5.3 in the Donetsk region, 1.2 in Kirovograd. And then they also compared to mild and moderate depression, 7.5% and 2.9%, which also demonstrates that depression is common with PTSD. It comes being a consequence of exposure to traumatic events. And here is a study from Israel, which basically showed that the probable PTSD prevalence almost doubled after the October 7th attack in 2020, was it 2023? This is my hometown, Split in Croatia. Very nice place, very nice climate, like here in Guadalajara. A bit different architecture, I would say. Resilience was something that the previous speaker has addressed, so I won't go into that, but I'll just tell you one important detail. PTSD is a condition, when we talk about PTSD, I'm not going into other things, but PTSD is a condition with a very good prognosis. We should never lose hope when it comes to treating PTSD. And it's a very treatable condition. The key is diagnosing it correctly and giving right treatment. According to a survey or a study done, it showed that 77% of people don't have PTSD symptoms after 10 years. Many of them get better very soon, in the first year or so. The rest of them gradually get better. But then we have about 23% of people who have a more chronic version of the condition. That's also good to know. Many of those people become our patients. And many of the people who get better spontaneously, we will never hear about. Think about how many raped women there are out there in the society who've never sought treatment and never got help for PTSD, but kind of managed it on their own, unfortunately. But fortunately, we have this resilience kind of pushing us forward and helping us to recover after experiencing terrible events in our lives. And to conclude, what should we think about? Different things, and I have some ideas. I hoped I managed to put some basis for understanding war trauma from my perspective. But first, I think it's essential to avoid the development of dependence and learned helplessness found so often in displaced refugee camps, as quoted in this article published some 20 years ago. And the title of this article is very nice, The Tragedy of War. Wars are tragic. But we shouldn't fall into despair. There's a lot of things we can do. As our colleagues at this conference I mentioned showed, you can still support people even when they're in an ongoing traumatic situation or an ongoing conflict. You can still support them, make it through the day. That's a very important thing for them, knowing that there's someone they can talk to. They know that you can't stop the war. They know that you can't do miracles, but you're there for them. You're there to listen. You can help them unburden themselves, even for that little while. Plus, refugees are very resilient. You know, it takes a lot of effort to leave your home alone or with your family and go to a third country where you don't know anyone, you don't have any support system, and so on, and to start your life all over again. It takes a lot of energy and resilience to be able. To conclude, these are the points I would like to reflect upon before concluding today's talk. We always need to appreciate the individuality of an experience. Every individual has a right to their own experience and to their own narrative regarding that experience. It's not one size fits all. So if someone has been through war, it doesn't mean that their experience is the same if they come from Syria just because they're from Syria. We always have to listen to what they're being told. These experiences can lead to complex emotions connected to a range of experiences during a longer time period. So it's usually not one situation or one event. It's usually multiple or a series of event situations covering a wide range of things. There might be differences in experience of war with groups of refugees, depending on social status, geography, potential role in the armed conflict. For example, it might not be the same to be a combatant, to be a soldier, or to be a civilian. Experiences are not limited to experience of loss, physical injury, death, destruction, or participation witnessing armed conflict. Maybe the more broader perspective of influencing system beliefs, trust, social injustice, economical situation, and so on. Effects of perceived justice and injustice are very important. For example, if we meet people who have experienced torture, it's very important to document their experience, even if it doesn't really lead to any further legal proceedings. It's still important to document these experiences, draw conclusions based on descriptions. And to summarize, war experiences are complex and individual. Normal reactions, as with everything, should not be pathologized. We shouldn't look for disease where there's no disease, where it's a normal reaction in normal or unnormal life situation. The importance of social support is crucial, as well as psychosocial interventions. Not everyone exposed to trauma develops PTSD or complex PTSD. There is an increased prevalence of mental illness in people with war experiences. And when it comes to treatment, I didn't really talk about that, but I'm going to do that tomorrow. Trauma-focused psychotherapy is still the first choice treatment for those who develop PTSD or complex PTSD. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bien, doctor Goran, se le entregan dos partes de un reconocimiento, algo muy tradicional de México, las Catrinas, que son propios de finales del mes de octubre, inicios de noviembre, y algo muy, muy jalisciense, tequila. Esperemos que lo disfrute y es artesanía. Muchísimas gracias por su participación. Very, very interesting conference.